For my 31st birthday, my mother-in-law handed me divorce papers wrapped in pink butterflies. I was surrounded by people who knew me as a waitress, not a woman whose marriage was being dissolved mid-dinner. David captured my reaction on his phone, eager to watch me break. Instead, I smiled, thanked her, signed the papers, and passed them back with the calm of someone holding a better hand. What they didn't know was that I'd already accepted a job offer that would uproot everything they thought they controlled. Before I continue narrating the story of Jennifer Walsh, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. 3 days before the party, I caught Margaret in our kitchen, hunched over legal documents like a hawk eyeing prey. The envelope she stuffed them into was elegant, almost too beautiful to be innocent. She smiled too wide and called it just some family paperwork, a phrase that now sounded like poison wrapped in silk. Her voice was sticky sweet, a performance that would have fooled anyone who hadn't lived with her brand of cruelty. I should have known then that whatever was in that envelope had nothing to do with celebration. Margaret had never shown interest in planning anything for me before. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. She barely acknowledged my existence beyond being David's wife. But that week, she called me twice to confirm plans, choosing Romano's restaurant, my workplace, as the venue for her grand gesture. She used words like meaningful and special, wrapping venom in velvet. Every call chipped away at my defenses, convincing me maybe, just maybe, I was finally being accepted. David played along, his eyes lighting up every time his phone buzzed. I caught him exchanging glances with his mother, quick little nods that spoke of shared secrets. When I asked, he said, "It's just birthday stuff. You'll love it." His excitement was genuine, but now I know it wasn't for me. It was for the show. The stage had been set, and I was the unwitting lead in a performance meant to shame. Emma, David's sister, had never cared for me either, always finding reasons to avoid events where I'd be present. But suddenly she was enthusiastic, offering to help decorate and coordinate the dinner. She sent texts laced with emojis and exclamation points, pretending friendship she'd never earned. I wanted to believe it, desperately clinging to the idea that maybe I'd finally broken through. I ignored the warning signs because I needed hope more than I needed clarity. The night before the party, Margaret called one last time. "Nothing too formal," she said about the dress code. "Just look your best." Her tone dripped with something like glee, and I mistook it for excitement. I chose a navy dress that hugged me in all the right places, paired with a thin gold necklace and my favorite heels. I wanted to look like someone worthy of being celebrated. David was tender that night, unusually so. He held me longer than normal, whispered how much he loved me, and said tomorrow would be unforgettable. I kissed him back, mistaking farewell for affection. He was already gone, emotionally if not physically. My dreams that night were filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the illusion of acceptance. That morning I arrived early at Romano's to help Sandra with the prep. Though I wasn't scheduled to work, habit drew me to the kitchen like muscle memory. I moved through the space as though I still belonged, checking on table settings and confirming the reservation. Mr. Romano winked when he saw me, saying, "Big day, huh?" I smiled, not knowing how big it would become. My shift ended at 5, and I went home to change, touching up my makeup and curling my hair. My hands shook slightly, a mix of nerves and hope winding tight in my chest. I rehearsed my thank you speech, expecting cake, maybe a few kind words, and finally, peace with Margaret. I tucked the hotel job offer into my purse, thinking maybe, just maybe, I'd share it after dessert. It felt like a secret weapon, though I hadn't yet realized how much I'd need it. We arrived at Romano's as golden sunlight poured through the front windows. My regulars were already there, waving, their smiles familiar and comforting. David squeezed my hand as we entered, his grip just a little too tight. Margaret sat already waiting, the decorated envelope in front of her like a crown jewel. Her expression was unreadable, not quite warm, not quite cold, just anticipatory. Dinner was strangely pleasant. Margaret asked about my classes, David refilled my water, and Emma laughed at things that weren't funny. They performed civility so well it made me question every hard edge of our past. I told myself maybe they were turning a corner, finally seeing me as something other than a waitress with no ambition. The kindness felt like an invitation, until the cake arrived. "Happy birthday, Jennifer." Sandra beamed, placing the chocolate ganache masterpiece in front of me. The restaurant clapped, and for a second, I let myself feel it. Loved, respected, part of something. David raised his phone, poised to capture the moment I blew out the candles. Margaret stood, envelope in hand, and said, "We have one more gift." Time slowed, and I felt the first tremor of dread ripple down my spine. The envelope was pink, with embossed silver butterflies. The same one I'd seen 3 days before in her purse. "Open it," Margaret urged, her voice bright and falsely tender. I hesitated, glancing at David, who nodded, still filming. Emma's phone hovered in her hand, too, both of them waiting like spectators at a bullfight. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were legal documents, thick, folded sheets with words that danced cruelly in front of my eyes. "Petition for dissolution of marriage," screamed in bold font at the top. Gasps echoed from surrounding tables as my face froze. This was the gift. A public gutting, filmed from multiple angles. They waited for the tears, for the drama, for the scene. But instead, I smiled. A slow, genuine smile that came not from pain, but from the delicious knowledge of what I held in my purse. "Thank you," I said, reaching for the pen David had preemptively placed beside the envelope. "This is the best thing you've ever given me." And I signed, carefully, decisively, without a quiver in my hand. David lowered his phone slowly, confused that his recording didn't capture the emotional meltdown they had choreographed. Margaret blinked at me, her expression twisting from satisfaction to something unsettled, like she couldn't compute what she was seeing. Emma's phone stayed in her hand, but she wasn't filming anymore, not when the story was no longer playing out the way she expected. I looked at each of them, letting the silence stretch, feeling the tension crackle like static in the room. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my envelope, thinner, plainer, but infinitely more powerful. "This is mine," I said softly, placing it on the table beside their decorated betrayal. "It's a job offer." I let those words hang there, ordinary and enormous, before continuing. "Guest Services Coordinator at the Grand Plaza Hotel, starting salary $45,000, with housing included." Margaret blinked, and her eyes darted to David, who looked like he'd just been handed a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. "You're lying," Emma muttered, but her voice lacked bite, cracking under disbelief. "You're not even qualified for something like that." She glanced at Margaret as if searching for confirmation that I couldn't possibly be telling the truth. "You've been rejected from everything." I opened the letter slowly, deliberately, and slid it across the table for them to read. "I start in 2 weeks," I said, reclaiming my voice with every syllable. They loved my experience at Romano's. They said I had the exact customer service skills they look for: grounded, capable, resilient, under pressure. Margaret stared at the page, but her mouth had gone slack. Emma looked down at her phone, suddenly very busy pretending this wasn't happening. A stunned hush fell over our corner of the restaurant, but at nearby tables, murmurs had started. Romano's regulars had always been observant, and they knew me, knew the way I walked through hard days and double shifts without complaint. Now they watched this moment unfold with interest that bordered on loyalty. Maria peeked out from the kitchen, catching my eye and nodding once, like she already knew something big had shifted. Even Tony, still clearing table 12, paused to see what had brought this cold air into a warm room. Margaret recovered first, her fingers twitching as she pushed the divorce papers back toward me. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice taut like a pulled thread. "David needs someone who fits his life, not a hotel clerk." David's jaw tightened, and for a second, he looked like he wanted to disappear into the booth. "He deserves a woman who can support his goals," she added, eyes flicking toward him. But David didn't speak. "I supported his goals," I replied, my tone sharper now, firmer. "I worked double shifts so he could start his firm. I cooked, cleaned, smiled through your insults, and dressed up for every one of your exhausting parties." I kept my gaze fixed on Margaret, unflinching. "And the second I chased my own goals, you handed me divorce papers, like I was a stray dog that wandered into your family." The table shook as Margaret stood abruptly, rattling the silverware. "You're twisting everything," she snapped, but her voice wasn't sure of itself anymore. This was about what's best for everyone involved. She looked around, realizing people were staring, and lowered her voice. "You should have just accepted what we gave you with grace." I stood too, feeling taller than I had in months. "You didn't give me anything. You tried to take away my dignity, my future, and my voice, and you wrapped it in butterflies." My eyes burned, but I didn't blink. "You wanted an ending, Margaret? You just watched me write my beginning." I turned toward Mr. Romano, who was standing nearby with crossed arms and a knowing smirk. "Congratulations, Jennifer," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, his eyes never leaving Margaret. "That hotel's lucky to have you." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the restaurant, and for the first time it was Margaret who felt out of place. Her perfect ambush had become a standing ovation for the woman she thought she'd crushed. She reached for her purse, gathering her things like they were shields. David still hadn't spoken, and now I looked at him, daring him to show some semblance of character. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. "Did you know she was going to do this tonight?" He hesitated, his silence speaking louder than anything else could. I watched his face fall under the weight of his own inaction. "I didn't know she'd bring them here," he said finally, voice brittle. I thought it would just be a conversation." His eyes met mine and dropped quickly. "She said it would be better if we did it together, while you were surrounded by people you knew." My chest tightened, not with pain, but with the final confirmation that he'd always stood behind his mother. "So you let her humiliate me," I said flatly. "You filmed it." I glanced at his phone, still lying on the table. Screen dark now, useless. "You handed me over to your mother like a problem to be solved." And then I turned to Emma. "You were in on it too." She shrugged, defiant, but deflated. Like a child caught red-handed. "You never belonged here," she said, but her words carried no venom now, only fatigue. "Mom was just trying to help David fix his life." I laughed, short and bitter. "Well, congratulations," I said. "You fixed it. I'm gone." I turned and walked toward the exit, the divorce papers in one hand and the job offer in the other. Behind me, their voices jumbled together like static. Confused, angry, scrambling to control a story they no longer owned. I stepped out into the night air, and it hit me like freedom. Cool and sharp, scented with garlic from the kitchen vents, and the distant laughter of real joy. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just breathed. I walked down the sidewalk outside Romano's, my heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation on a final sentence. Behind me, I could still hear the muffled sounds of the restaurant, laughter, dishes clinking, conversations that had nothing to do with my unraveling marriage. But I felt weightless, like shedding that envelope had peeled a layer off my soul. The cold night air wrapped around my shoulders like something close to kindness. I exhaled slowly, letting the moment wash over me. The envelope with my job offer still rested in my hand, now a symbol of everything they hadn't seen coming. I traced the folded crease with my thumb, grounding myself in its truth. This wasn't just employment. It was escape, purpose, identity, everything Margaret said I didn't have. I glanced up at the sky and laughed softly to myself. Somewhere between my humiliation and their performance, I'd been reborn. I walked to my car parked along the curb, unlocking it with a steady hand. Sliding into the driver's seat, I placed the job offer gently on the passenger side, as if it were another person who'd stood by me tonight. The interior smelled like vanilla and lavender, a scent from the car freshener I bought last week on a whim. It was the smell of trying again. And now, it smelled like victory. My phone buzzed on the console, David's name lighting up the screen. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at the message preview. My silence would be the only answer he needed. I wasn't going to comfort him while he processed losing the version of me he'd taken for granted. A second message came through, this time from Emma, then a third from Margaret. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 2 years, they'd ignored, undermined, and dismissed me. Now they were racing to control the narrative that had slipped from their hands. I turned the phone face down, refusing to let them back into the one thing they'd never respected: my peace. Tonight they could sit in their confusion. The drive home was short, but every traffic light felt like a checkpoint on my personal freedom trail. I caught glimpses of myself in reflective surfaces, storefront windows, rear-view mirrors, and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Calm, confident, untouchable. I parked in front of our townhouse, the porch light casting soft gold across the walkway. My stomach clenched, realizing David would be home soon, if he wasn't already. I needed to get inside, pack, and leave before the guilt of his silence tried to root me in place again. I unlocked the door and stepped into the space we used to call ours, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. I walked past the entryway table, ignoring the framed photo of us from the honeymoon in Maui. That woman was gone. She'd smiled too much and asked too little. Tonight, I was something newer, forged by dismissal, steadied by resolve. My shoes echoed down the hallway as I walked toward the bedroom. Inside the closet, I pulled a suitcase from the top shelf and unzipped it on the bed. I didn't need everything, just enough to make a clean break. Comfortable clothes, my work shoes, the notebook with my college class notes, and the documents from the hotel. Everything else could stay. David could divide the dishes and towels with Margaret. In the bathroom, I grabbed my toiletries with practiced efficiency, my reflection watching me with a mix of curiosity and awe. I didn't look sad or betrayed. I looked alive. The woman in the mirror knew something they didn't. She'd already survived the worst of them. Everything now was just cleanup. I paused at my nightstand and opened the drawer where I kept small, personal things. A card from my dad who passed when I was 17, a dried flower from my college application celebration, a cheap necklace David gave me on our first anniversary. I took the card and the flower. The necklace stayed. The front door opened as I zipped the suitcase shut. David's footsteps moved cautiously across the living room floor like he wasn't sure what to expect. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bag at my feet, and waited for him to reach me. The moment felt quiet but swollen, like air before a storm. When he appeared in the doorway, his face was a mixture of shock, regret, and residual pride that hadn't yet faded. "You're really doing this," he said, his voice low. "You're leaving tonight." I nodded once. There was no use explaining the obvious. "I didn't want it to go like that," he added, but I didn't believe him. "You filmed it, David." My voice was soft, but the weight of those words cracked between us. "You sat there, phone in hand, waiting for me to fall apart." He looked down at his shoes, the expensive leather ones I helped him pick out for his first client pitch. "You didn't want it to go that way. You just didn't want to feel bad when it did." He moved closer, but I stood, lifting my suitcase with one hand and stepping back with the other. "Don't," I warned. "You don't get to comfort me now." He stopped mid-step, hands dropping helplessly at his sides. "You let her hand me divorce papers on my birthday." He blinked, jaw twitching like he wanted to argue, but he couldn't. We both knew the truth. Silence was complicity. "Where will you go?" he asked. I offered a small, knowing smile. "Somewhere I'm appreciated." I brushed past him gently, not out of affection but closure. The hallway stretched before me like a new beginning. I didn't cry, not even when I reached the front door and realized it would be the last time I opened it. There was no need for grief when freedom was waiting. I stepped into the night, suitcase rolling behind me, ready for everything they said I couldn't have. I booked a room at a small roadside motel just outside the city, far enough that Margaret wouldn't casually drop by, but close enough for my final shifts at Romano's. The room was dim and smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner, but it was mine for now. I placed the job offer on the desk, smoothing its edges like a sacred artifact. It wasn't just a contract. It was evidence I hadn't wasted the last 2 years trying to prove myself to people who never cared. I fell asleep without unpacking, exhaustion curling around me like a heavy blanket. The next morning, I woke to pale sunlight filtering through the floral-patterned curtains. I blinked slowly, then smiled as I remembered I didn't have to check in with David or ask Margaret's opinion on anything. For the first time in years, I belonged only to myself. My phone buzzed again, still desperate to pull me back into their chaos, but I silenced it without reading the messages. I didn't need more apologies that weren't real. At Romano's, I arrived 10 minutes early, like always, wearing my most comfortable black flats and the crisp uniform I'd ironed 2 days ago. Mr. Romano raised an eyebrow when he saw me walk through the kitchen door. "Didn't expect to see you after last night," he said gently. I gave him a tired smile, setting my purse in the back room. I still got a few shifts left. I finish what I start. Maria greeted me with a warm hug, smelling like garlic and flour, her strong arms wrapping around me with something close to love. "You made them look like fools," she whispered into my hair, pulling back to study my face. "But you looked like a queen doing it." Her praise hit something soft in my chest, and I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. For all the things I was leaving behind, this kitchen had always felt like home. The lunch rush came quickly, full of regulars who asked careful questions without being nosy. Word had spread fast. I was the waitress who stood up to her in-laws and walked away with a job offer. Mrs. Chin left me a $20 tip on a $6 order, squeezing my hand on her way out. "Proud of you, sweetheart," she whispered, eyes bright behind her reading glasses. I didn't correct her. I just whispered, "Thank you." During my break, I sat outside on the concrete steps behind the restaurant, sipping sweet tea Maria had slipped me in a to-go cup. I watched cars pass on the street beyond the alley, each one a tiny symbol of movement. In 2 weeks, I'd be in a new city, learning new routines, maybe even starting fresh friendships. I didn't know if I was ready, but I knew I was willing. And that was more than I'd ever felt staying in Margaret's orbit. David hadn't stopped texting, and now voicemails were piling up. Some sounded urgent, others rambling, a few pleading for one last conversation. But I didn't owe him that. The marriage had ended the moment he stayed silent while his mother handed me that envelope. If he wanted closure, he could find it in the video he filmed. My last night at Romano's came too fast, and I found myself staring at the clock between orders, trying to slow time. Maria made my favorite dish for family meal, rigatoni and vodka sauce with fresh basil, and Tony wrote, "You're gonna crush it" on my to-go box with permanent marker. Mr. Romano pulled me aside as the shift ended, handing me a white envelope with my final paycheck and something extra tucked inside. "Consider it an investment," he said gruffly. "You're not just staff here, you're family." I hugged him tighter than I thought he'd allow, surprised when he didn't pull away. "Thank you for seeing me," I whispered. He nodded, eyes red-rimmed, then muttered something about getting back to payroll. As I changed out of my uniform for the last time, I folded it neatly and placed it in my tote bag, unsure whether I'd ever be ready to let it go completely. The fabric held years of quiet battles. On my way out, Maria stopped me with a small gift bag tied with blue ribbon. "Open it when you get there," she said, kissing my cheek. "Just a little reminder of who you are." I smiled, clutching it to my chest as I walked out of Romano's and into the crisp night air. The door shut behind me with a final chime. Back at the motel, I laid everything out on the bed: my job offer, Mr. Romano's envelope, Maria's gift bag, and my favorite pen. I took a deep breath and began writing my official acceptance email to Jessica Martinez. Every word was intentional, clear, and unapologetic. I thanked her for the opportunity and confirmed my start date. When I hit send, something lifted in my chest like helium. Then I opened Maria's gift bag, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a delicate chain with a small fork charm, silver and simple, tied to a handwritten note. "You served them with grace," it read in Maria's uneven script. "Now serve yourself something better." I stared at it for a long time, then clipped it around my neck and sat quietly in the room that no longer felt so temporary. A few days later, I packed the last of my things and checked out of the motel. The drive to the new city took just under 3 hours, winding through stretches of farmland and clusters of buildings that slowly grew taller as I approached downtown. Grand Plaza Hotel stood like a jewel in the skyline, its name etched in polished silver across the entrance. I parked around back near the employee residential lot and retrieved the welcome packet they'd mailed. Apartment 3B, freshly cleaned, furnished, and filled with possibility. The apartment was small but elegant, with floor-length windows that let in golden light and a couch that didn't sag in the middle. There was a welcome basket on the kitchen counter, tea, snacks, a handwritten card from Jessica. "We're thrilled to have you on the team," it said, and for the first time in years, I believed the words. I hung up a few clothes, placed Maria's necklace on the dresser, and stared out at the city with a slow, building smile. Orientation at Grand Plaza Hotel began the next morning, and I dressed in a soft cream blouse and tailored navy slacks that made me feel quietly powerful. My new name badge, Jennifer Walsh, Guest Services Coordinator, gleamed under the soft lighting of the conference room. Jessica Martinez welcomed us personally, her presence as warm and efficient as I remembered from our phone calls. She introduced me to a few other coordinators, all of whom had hospitality backgrounds ranging from airline service to cruise ships. For the first time, my restaurant experience wasn't a punchline. It was part of a professional mosaic. We toured the hotel as a group, walking through marbled lobbies, elegant ballrooms, and guest suites that sparkled with understated luxury. Every corner of the Grand Plaza whispered excellence, but it wasn't intimidating. It was aspirational. I caught my reflection in the polished elevator door and saw someone who belonged. No one here knew about Margaret or the butterflies, or the way I signed divorce papers with a camera in my face. That part of my life felt distant, like a movie I'd watched once and didn't need to re-watch. Jessica partnered me with a senior coordinator named Lila for shadowing, a sharp woman with a warm laugh and a no-nonsense attitude. "I heard you came from food service," Lila said as we set up the VIP welcome desk. "You'll be better at this than half the business school hires. Trust me." Her confidence in me felt earned, not patronizing. I watched the way she handled guests, gracious but firm, and tried to mimic her calm authority. That week passed in a blur of name memorization, welcome packets, elevator codes, and high heels that pinched but didn't slow me down. I came home each night to my quiet apartment, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed into the plush couch with a strange kind of peace. There were no texts from David, no surprise visits from Margaret, no dinner tables with forced politeness, just me, my own space, and the slow, sacred return of self-worth. I started sleeping through the night again. On Friday, Jessica called me into her office after our afternoon shift. "You're settling in beautifully," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "We're hosting a gala next week for the city's business alliance. I'd like you to coordinate our VIP check-in and press table." I blinked, surprised at the level of trust she was already offering. "Are you sure?" I asked, but Jessica just smiled. "You were managing entire dinner rushes while being emotionally tortured. I think you can handle a guest list and some journalists," she said lightly. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. The gala became my singular focus for the next few days. Spreadsheets, RSVPs, dietary preferences, and hotel room assignments for out-of-town speakers. My clipboard became an extension of my hand. I even started arriving early just to make sure the event notes were perfect. On the morning of the gala, I woke before my alarm, heart fluttering not from anxiety but anticipation. I slipped into a charcoal gray dress with a modest neckline and three-quarter sleeves, paired with low heels and Maria's silver fork charm tucked beneath the fabric. It felt like armor. My hair curled just right, and my makeup was subtle but polished. I looked like someone Margaret would never recognize. The event went off without a hitch. Guests were greeted with champagne, local media found their badges without a single hiccup, and the ballroom buzzed with the hum of wealth and opportunity. Jessica gave me a thumbs up from across the room as I directed a couple toward the elevators. I felt useful, visible, and competent in a way that Romanos could never quite reach. At one point, I even laughed with Lila over a catering mix-up that would have once spiraled me into panic. At the end of the night, while the last of the guests filtered out and the cleanup staff moved in, Jessica pulled me aside again. "You handled that like a pro," she said. "If you're open to it, I'd like to nominate you for our management training track." My breath caught, stunned that something I'd once begged for in job applications was now being offered without me asking. "Yes," I said simply, the word feeling holy. "Yes, I'd love that." That weekend, I took myself out for brunch at a quiet cafe near the river, something I'd never done alone during my marriage. I brought a journal and made a list titled Things I've Gained Since Letting Go. The first few entries were obvious: peace, privacy, freedom. Then I added my name back, my pride, my mornings. I sat there for an hour, writing until the sun moved across the table. On Monday, a message pinged into my inbox from an unfamiliar email address. The subject line read, "Your family wants to talk." My heart sank. I clicked it open to find a long message from Emma, surprisingly articulate, asking if we could talk privately. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened at Romano's," she wrote. "Maybe I didn't realize how cruel we were until I saw everyone clapping for you." She didn't ask for forgiveness. Not exactly, but she said Margaret had been rattled by how it all played out. "She thought you'd beg," Emma admitted. "She thought you'd cry and give David a chance to swoop in, but you just walked away like you'd already won, and maybe that's what scared her the most." I didn't reply right away. I reread the message 3 times, unsure whether it was remorse or just curiosity about who I'd become. I finally wrote back, "I'm not angry anymore. But I'm also not available for anything that looks like guilt management. If you want a conversation, it needs to come with truth, not just regret." She didn't respond immediately, and that was fine. I had more important things to do. That week, I began training modules in hospitality leadership, finance reports, personnel scheduling, conflict resolution, and discovered that I enjoyed the logic of operations more than I'd expected. Jessica paired me with a mentor from the executive suite, a woman named Dana, who had risen from front desk clerk to director in under 6 years. Dana didn't waste time. "You want to move up?" she asked during our first meeting. "Then don't wait for permission. Start acting like the person who already has the job." Her advice clicked with something inside me. Margaret had waited for my collapse. I was building my rise. Dana's mentorship pushed me harder than I expected, but it was the kind of pressure that polished rather than crushed. She reviewed my reports with a red pen that reminded me of Margaret's old legal edits, except Dana's notes built bridges instead of walls. "You're not wrong, just unfinished," she'd say, circling numbers and phrases with arrows leading toward growth. Unlike Margaret's criticisms, Dana's guidance came without condescension or smugness. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that reflected who I could become, not just who I'd been. On the 3rd week of management training, I received a call from Romano's. Maria's voice came through the line like a balm, soft and familiar. "Linda, Margaret's friend, stopped in for lunch," she said carefully. "She asked about you and mentioned you'd shown up in her social circle again." I could practically hear Maria roll her eyes. Apparently, Linda had attended the business gala as a guest of one of the local council members and had been stunned by my new position. "She said you looked so polished," Maria added with a chuckle. "Like a CEO's assistant or something." I could picture the tight smile on Linda's face, trying to reconcile the woman they dismissed with a woman running guest operations at a luxury hotel. "She asked if you'd been faking your ambition all along," Maria said, unable to hide the satisfaction in her voice. "I wasn't faking," I told her. "I was just growing." Maria sighed like she'd been waiting to hear that for a long time. "Proud of you, Mija," she said before hanging up. Her words lingered longer than the conversation. Every affirmation I hadn't gotten from David's family now bloomed freely in places they no longer occupied. The next Monday, Jessica called me into her office again, this time with a guest. Margaret's friend Linda sat across from her, clearly uncomfortable but doing her best to remain composed. Ms. Walsh. She greeted me, not using my first name like she used to when she called me the waitress. I nodded politely, feeling the ground beneath me stay firm. "I just wanted to say," she began, "we were surprised, impressed really, by what you've done here." Jessica glanced at me, giving me the option to steer the moment. "Thank you," I said, my voice professional and light. "I've had a great team." Linda's mouth twitched at my calmness, clearly hoping for some acknowledgement of how far I'd come. But I wasn't going to offer relief to someone who had once called my work temporary confusion. I stayed still, letting the silence make her uncomfortable instead. "Well, I'll let you ladies get back to it," she said quickly, gathering her designer bag and rising. "Just thought I'd drop in and say hello while I was on site." Jessica stood to shake her hand, but I didn't move. My stillness was my refusal. My silence was my boundary. After she left, Jessica laughed quietly, folding her arms. "She tried so hard to sound gracious," she said, "but she was fishing for something, probably a weakness." I nodded, brushing a stray hair from my blazer. "They're not used to seeing me in rooms like this." "They better get used to it," Jessica replied, and the truth in her words settled deep in my bones. That week, I received a formal offer to take on assistant manager responsibilities during Dana's travel assignments. I signed the papers the same day, initials crisp and confident in the corner of every page. The title felt like armor, but the work felt like purpose. I wasn't just escaping anymore, I was building. Emma reached out again later that week, her tone and messages more tempered now. She asked if I'd be willing to talk in person, just once, to clear the air. "No hidden agenda," she promised. "No Margaret, just me." I hesitated, but curiosity and closure are twin temptations that rarely show up alone. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral ground where neither of us had history. Emma looked smaller than I remembered, still fashionable, still composed, but lacking the edge she used to wield so freely. "I deserved everything you said at Romano's," she said, fingers wrapped tightly around her latte. "And honestly, I've replayed that night more than I care to admit." I stayed quiet, giving her room to speak. "David misses you," she added after a pause, her voice heavier now. "Not just because you left, but because you left with dignity. And he didn't know what that looked like until it was gone." I looked at her, reading between the lines of her sisterly regret. "That's not a door I plan to reopen," I said calmly. "I don't need closure from people who watched me drown and handed me a towel after I swam to shore." Emma nodded, accepting the rebuke without flinching. "I just wanted to tell you that I get it now, and I hope someday, if we're ever in the same room again, you won't hate me." I didn't promise her anything, but I also didn't lie. When I returned to the hotel that evening, my apartment felt warmer than usual. The sunset bathed the balcony in gold, and I sat with my tea, watching city lights flicker on one by one. I had no desire to text anyone from my old life. I wasn't mourning anymore. I was growing roots in a place that nurtured me. That weekend, I volunteered to assist with a charity event hosted in the hotel ballroom, a fundraiser for women re-entering the workforce after hardship. As I helped guests find their tables and directed speakers backstage, I found myself genuinely moved by the stories being shared. Women like me, dismissed, underestimated, and quietly powerful, were speaking about their second chances. My eyes welled more than once, but not from sadness. It was the recognition of shared strength. Dana introduced me to the keynote speaker, a former executive turned entrepreneur who specialized in professional reinvention. "This one," Dana said, gesturing to me, "is on her way up." The woman shook my hand, her grip firm and warm. "Stay where they celebrate you," she said simply, "not just where they tolerate you." I replayed the keynote speaker's words as I folded laundry that night, her voice echoing like a quiet command in my new life. Stay where they celebrate you. It was simple advice, but I'd spent years ignoring its truth, trying to mold myself into someone worthy of tolerance, not joy. Now, even the act of choosing my own detergent, my own sheets, my own rhythm felt radical. I didn't need David's approval, Margaret's permission, or Emma's understanding. On Monday, I found a small envelope slipped under my apartment door. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably David's tight, familiar, always slanted left. I stood staring at it for a full minute before I picked it up. Inside was a single page folded once. No greeting, no apology, just a paragraph. I saw the event photos online. You looked happy. That used to be me standing beside you. I hope you're still laughing the way you were in that picture. I read it twice, then placed it in the trash without ceremony. There was a time when that letter might have wrecked me, peeled back old wounds just enough to bleed. But now it felt small, like a whisper in a room full of applause. David didn't want me. He wanted the reflection of himself he used to see in my eyes. And that reflection was gone the moment he let his mother speak louder than his vows. That same day, Jessica pulled me aside to let me know Dana had submitted my name for the department's internal leadership spotlight. "It's not just a feature," Jessica said. "It puts you on the fast track for management if you decide to stay long-term." The words struck me as surreal. Not because I didn't believe I deserved it, but because I'd spent so long convincing others I did. Now people just believed. There was no test to pass, no silent jury waiting to disapprove. The spotlight feature involved an interview, a headshot, and a summary of my path to hospitality, something I dreaded at first. I didn't want to relive the Romanos chapters or the cold silences at Margaret's dinner table, but Dana gave me a framework. Tell the truth, but tell it like it's yours, not like you're still asking permission to claim it. So I did. I wrote about customer service, about resilience, about learning to lead without ever being taught how to speak. The article was published in the company's internal magazine and pinned to the staff bulletin board just outside the break room. The next morning, coworkers stopped me in the hallway with smiles, compliments, and quiet nods of respect. One of the janitorial staff, an older man named Clarence, gave me a fist bump and said, "You made it sound like we matter." I blinked away tears and thanked him. Recognition from people who knew struggle hit differently. That week, I received a friend request from someone I hadn't heard from in over a year. David's cousin Michael. I paused before accepting, trying to remember if he'd ever treated me poorly. He hadn't. He'd kept his distance during family events, usually burying himself in his phone or staying on the outskirts of Margaret's drama. I accepted with caution, but within minutes, a message arrived. "Saw your article. You've always been smarter than all of them gave you credit for." I replied politely, thanking him and leaving it there. A few hours later, another message followed. "Emma's been bragging about you to her friends lately. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone and setting it aside. Whether Emma's admiration was genuine or revisionist history didn't matter anymore. My story didn't need their validation to be real. The version of me they overlooked had built a life they couldn't now ignore. Still, the ripple effect intrigued me. How one act of public grace could unbalance an entire private hierarchy. I wondered if Margaret had read the article. 2 days later, I found out she had. Linda returned to the hotel, this time with no appointment, just a social visit that coincidentally ended at the front desk during my shift. She didn't ask for me, but the hesitation in her voice when she saw me suggested she wasn't surprised. "You're really doing something here," she said, avoiding eye contact. I smiled politely and nodded. She stood there awkwardly for a moment before adding, "Margaret read your interview." She didn't say much, but she cut it out and put it in a drawer in her office. That image alone felt more satisfying than any apology could have been. The woman who had planned my public collapse now kept a paper monument to my survival tucked away in a drawer. My silence in that moment was deliberate, controlled, and deeply satisfying. That weekend, I treated myself to dinner at a small rooftop restaurant overlooking the city skyline. The waiter complimented my necklace, Maria's silver fork, and asked if it had special meaning. "It reminds me where I came from," I said with a smile. I thought about sending Maria a photo, but I knew she'd be prouder of the fact I was living well, not just dressing the part. That night, I went home with a full heart and an empty inbox. As the weeks passed, I adjusted to the rhythm of a job that valued me, and a life that reflected my choices. I bought new furniture piece by piece, picked art that made me smile, and started a weekend routine that included yoga in the park and solo movie nights. Loneliness didn't haunt me like I feared it would. It felt like space, clean, honest space, where nothing echoed except my own thoughts, and they were no longer cruel. Emma emailed me again a month later, this time with a photo attachment. It was a snapshot of me from that birthday dinner, the moment I stood at the table with the signed divorce papers in one hand and the job offer in the other. "I never deleted the video," she wrote, "but this is the frame I go back to. You didn't look broken, you looked free." I stared at the image for a long time, studying my own face. She was right. I didn't look like a woman losing everything. I looked like a woman choosing something better. And I was. I didn't respond to Emma's message, but I didn't delete it either. The photo, that moment frozen in time, had a quiet power I hadn't expected. I saved it to my desktop under a folder called Proof, right next to copies of my job offer, my spotlight interview, and the email confirming my management track enrollment. That folder wasn't for anyone else's validation. It was for me, a record of resilience that didn't need narration. Some people kept scrapbooks. I kept receipts. My promotion to Assistant Guest Services Manager became official 2 weeks after the interview article circulated. Dana called me into her office to share the news with a small celebratory toast. Just sparkling cider in paper cups, but it tasted better than champagne. "You earned this," she said, placing a printed certificate in front of me. "And not because you're impressive on paper, because you make people feel seen." I stared at the certificate for a long time before taking it in both hands. It was clean, simple, and elegant, just like the job title etched in raised silver at the bottom. I felt my throat tighten, not because I doubted I deserved it, but because I finally believed I did. For so long, I'd operated under the assumption that being chosen meant being worthy. Now I understood that choosing myself had always been the real work. That afternoon, I treated my team to pastries from the bakery down the block. Lila hugged me and said, "Told you you'd be better than half the suits here." Clarence gave me a crooked thumbs up and said, "Don't forget us when you're CEO." Even the night shift staff, who rarely crossed paths with me, stopped by to congratulate me in person. Their support felt deeper than polite applause. It felt like community. Later that evening, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my apartment, still dressed in my uniform. I turned slightly left, then right, then back again, just looking. My posture had changed. My eyes looked sharper. I looked like someone I would have admired 2 years ago. In my free time, I started volunteering with the same women's workforce nonprofit that had hosted the charity event at the hotel. I led mock interviews, helped edit resumes, and offered encouragement that came from lived experience, not theory. Every woman I met had a different version of the same story. Underestimated, overlooked, slowly rebuilding. I didn't see failures in them. I saw beginnings. And I saw the version of myself that Margaret never bothered to meet. One evening, after a long session helping a single mom prepare for her interview at a tech firm, I found a letter slipped under my apartment door again. This time, the envelope was ivory, and the handwriting belonged to Margaret. My breath caught, but I didn't open it immediately. I left it on the kitchen counter overnight, like a fragile thing that needed to prove it could behave. The next morning, with coffee in hand, I finally unfolded the paper. It was short, unapologetic in the way that only women like Margaret could manage. "I've seen the photos. Linda talks. So does Emma. You're doing better than we expected, than I expected. I still don't agree with how everything happened, but I won't deny that you've handled yourself gracefully." There was no signature, just a dash at the bottom like she'd trailed off and left the rest unsaid. I placed the letter beside David's and smiled. That dash was the first crack in a fortress she'd built with iron standards and gold-plated judgment. It wasn't love, and it wasn't reconciliation. It was something closer to surrender. That weekend, I hosted my first dinner in the apartment. Nothing fancy, just pasta, fresh bread, and a bottle of affordable wine. I invited 2 coworkers, a few of the women I'd mentored, and Maria, who arrived with homemade tiramisu in a cooler and tears in her eyes. "This is who you always were," she whispered, pulling me into a long hug. "They just didn't want to see it." We lit candles and toasted to freedom disguised as hard decisions. Maria sat beside me all night, holding court like a proud aunt, retelling the birthday party story with the flair of a seasoned storyteller. Everyone laughed at the image of me signing divorce papers in a navy dress, then pulling a job offer from my purse like a magician revealing her final trick. "She didn't cry," Maria said, eyes twinkling. She smiled, like a woman who already had somewhere else to be. The next day I opened an email from Jessica marked confidential. It included a list of internal candidates being considered for hotel-wide operations training, a precursor to regional roles. My name was fourth on the list. I stared at it, the realization landing quietly and completely. I wasn't just being trusted. I was being prepared for something more. I replied with a thank you and a request for more information. Jessica responded with a meeting invite and a note. "We always knew you'd rise. Now we're just making sure the ladder's sturdy." I sat back in my chair, letting the words soak in. They didn't feel like flattery. They felt like truth I'd earned. That evening, I walked to a small bookstore down the street and bought myself a journal. The cover was leather, and the first page was blank, a kind of invitation. I titled it Proof, Part 2, and began the first entry with a single sentence. They tried to rewrite me, but I chose the pen instead. The words felt final and beginning all at once. The meeting with Jessica took place in her office. The door closed, the blinds half drawn against the late afternoon sun. She slid a folder across the desk with my name typed neatly on the tab, her smile proud but reserved. "If you accept, this starts in 6 weeks," she said. "It's a hybrid role, still based here, but you'll train under regional operations for 6 months, preparing you for multi-property management." I ran my fingers along the edge of the folder, heart thudding with both disbelief and certainty. Jessica sat back in her chair, her expression shifting into something more personal. "I've watched you walk into this place every day like you were building something invisible," she said, "and now it's visible." My eyes burned, but I blinked the tears away. "Thank you for seeing it before I did," I whispered, voice steadier than I felt. I spent that evening going over every page in the folder. The terms generous, the expectations high, the opportunities limitless. The hotel chain was preparing a leadership cohort for future regional directors, and my inclusion wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. My old fears returned briefly, whispering questions about whether I belonged, whether I could really hold my own among people with MBAs and corporate pedigrees. But the answer came in the mirror. I'd been managing people, spaces, and chaos long before they gave me a title. I just hadn't called it leadership because no one had handed me a podium. I called Maria the next morning and told her the news between sips of coffee and laughter. "Of course you're going regional," she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I've seen the way you run a floor, like it's a kingdom, and everyone's safe under your watch." I flushed with warmth, writing her words in the back of my journal later that night. Kingdoms don't have to be castles. As the 6 weeks passed, I prepared quietly, taking on more tasks without fanfare. I trained my replacement, mentored new hires, and sat in on cross-department meetings I'd once never been invited to. Dana gave me folders of operational challenges from other properties and asked how I'd solve them. I didn't flinch. I offered solutions, budgets, timelines, and each time, she nodded with a small smile that said I was exactly where I belonged. One evening, while reviewing a spreadsheet for a new concierge rotation plan, a new message pinged into my inbox. This time it wasn't from David or Emma or Margaret, it was from Romanos. Sandra, the waitress who had carried my birthday cake to the table that night, was writing. "I just wanted to tell you I saw your article and cried," she wrote. "I tell new hires about you all the time, the one who took her pain and turned it into power." I replied with heartfelt thanks and a promise to stop by next time I visited the city. Her message reminded me how many people had been silent witnesses to my transformation, rooting for me even when I didn't know it. Sometimes, you don't need a crowd cheering, just one person clapping quietly in the back. I reread her message 3 times before archiving it into my proof folder. It belonged among the rest of my triumphs. Emma sent another message a few days later, this one different from the rest. There were no questions, no explanations, just a forwarded email from Margaret. It had no greeting or signature, just a clipped sentence. "She's done more with rejection than most do with privilege." I read it once, twice, then shut my laptop and went for a walk around the block. I didn't need to respond to Margaret's words. Their existence was enough. On my final day before the regional cohort began, the hotel staff threw a small going-away breakfast in the break room. Lila brought balloons, Clarence made his famous blueberry muffins, and Jessica gave me a framed print of the city skyline. On the back, she'd written, "Because every view looks different when you've climbed your way up." I hugged each of them, promising I'd visit as often as the new schedule allowed. When I left the building that afternoon, it was with a full heart and no unfinished business. The regional training began with a retreat in Chicago, 3 days of workshops, seminars, and leadership assessments. The first night, I sat in a room of 20 other rising leaders, each with stories of fast-track success, Ivy League degrees, and family connections. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I stood slowly, pulse racing. "I started in a restaurant where I was told I didn't belong," I said. "Now I help shape environments that make sure no one ever feels that way again." There was a pause, then a murmur of approval, then soft applause. I sat back down, breathing evenly, grounding myself in the silence that followed. I wasn't the loudest or the most polished, but I was the most unshakable, and people noticed. The speaker that evening singled out my introduction, calling it a masterclass in anchoring narrative to mission. Throughout the retreat, I bonded with 2 other women, Priya, a former cruise line supervisor, and Elena, who'd managed 3 boutique hotels before joining corporate. We shared stories late into the night over decaf coffee and 2 sweet pastries, comparing scars and triumphs. Priya had been laid off twice before finally landing a job that valued her multicultural background. Elena had worked under a director who stole credit until she documented everything and exposed him. We weren't competing. We were comparing armor. One evening, Priya turned to me and said, "You're the calmest person here." I smiled, sipping my tea. "I've already survived the storm," I said. "Everything else is just weather." Elena nodded and raised her mug in salute. To weather, we know how to dress for. By the end of the retreat, I was selected as one of 5 participants for a year-long pilot mentorship with the regional VP. Jessica sent me a congratulatory message that read, "Some people are born into the room. Others build the room and hold the door open." I stared at those words for a long time, remembering the dining room at Romano's, the envelope of divorce papers, the expectant cameras. I had walked through a door they'd built to trap me and walked out holding the keys. And I wasn't coming back to apologize for surviving. Returning from the Chicago retreat felt like stepping into a new skin, familiar, but sharper around the edges. My apartment greeted me with its usual quiet, the city humming outside, as if it too had waited to see what I'd become. I unpacked, slowly, carefully hanging the framed photo Priya had taken of the 3 of us laughing on the hotel rooftop. Beneath it, I placed a small plaque from the mentorship ceremony. Just my name, the hotel's logo, and the words "Emerging Leader." It looked modest, but it felt like a medal carved from every moment they told me I'd never make it. The next day, a letter arrived. Not a forwarded email or a passive-aggressive envelope, but an actual handwritten letter addressed in Margaret's ornate slanted script. I opened it over the kitchen sink, half expecting clipped words or veiled superiority. Instead, the first line made me freeze. "You were never the failure I feared." I was. The sentence stood alone, bold and unflinching, like she'd finally admitted something she couldn't dress in etiquette. I kept reading, unsure whether to brace or breathe. "I wanted control because I didn't understand your kind of strength, the quiet kind, the stubborn kind, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. I saw your resilience and mistook it for defiance. I confused silence with weakness, and ambition with rebellion. What you did that night at Romano's, I thought it would ruin David, but instead, it revealed me." The ink smudged slightly in the lower corner, like she'd paused long enough to consider not sending it. There was no apology in the traditional sense, no list of wrongs or promises to change. But the letter didn't ask for my forgiveness either. It acknowledged me, fully. That was more than I ever expected from her. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of my proof folder, where it couldn't distract me but also couldn't be erased. Margaret had spent years trying to define me through absence, of status, of pedigree, of potential. Now, in quiet penmanship, she'd admitted I'd been whole the entire time. I didn't need to respond. The silence between us finally said something true. 3 weeks into my mentorship, I was asked to co-present at a hospitality summit in Atlanta. Jessica called me with the news, her voice bright with excitement. "They want someone who understands both frontline realities and executive vision," she said. "That's you." I stared at my calendar, blinking at the name of the summit like it was written in someone else's story. The topic was modern leadership and guest experience, but my speech was really about rebuilding, not just services, but selves. I told the audience about the way empathy had trained me more than textbooks, and how people remember how you make them feel long after they forget your title. The applause came like rain, steady, cleansing, unexpected. Several people approached afterward asking for copies of my notes. One woman said, "You didn't just speak, you testified." After the summit, Elena messaged me from another city, telling me she'd been offered a director role. Priya landed a job as regional manager for a cruise line's luxury division. We all celebrated via video chat, holding up champagne flutes and laughing at how the world used to try and shrink us. "Imagine if we'd believed them," Elena said, grinning. "Imagine if we stayed where we were only tolerated." Back at Grand Plaza, the lobby was being redecorated for the upcoming Winter Gala, the hotel's biggest internal celebration of the year. Jessica approached me in the hallway with a strange smile and a clipboard. "You're not just helping with the event," she said. "You're hosting it. This time, the mic is yours." The night of the gala, I stood at the podium in a black dress with capped sleeves and Maria's fork charm tucked just beneath the neckline. The room shimmered with golden lights and the low hum of people who had stopped underestimating me long ago. "Welcome," I said into the microphone, my voice calm and sure. "Tonight isn't just a celebration of our success. It's proof of what happens when resilience is allowed to rise." The crowd erupted in applause, and somewhere near the back I spotted Clarence clapping like he always had. After the gala, as the last guests trickled out, Jessica handed me a gift bag wrapped in dark blue tissue paper. "Open it when you're alone," she said, winking before disappearing into the elevator. At home, I peeled back the tissue to find a small engraved plaque. It read, "She built the table they wouldn't let her sit at and invited others to join." My breath caught in my throat, and for the first time in months, I cried without shame. The next morning, I received a photo in my inbox from Emma. No subject line, no message, just an image of Margaret's home office desk. The framed copy of my spotlight interview sat beside a folded letter I recognized as my job offer. Behind it was a photo of David and me from years ago, turned backward, face down against the shelf. I stared at it for a long time, then closed my laptop with a gentle finality. Some stories don't need sequels. They just need a good ending. Mine had been written not in one grand act, but in quiet choices stacked like bricks, steady and sure. I didn't walk away from that family with rage. I walked away with direction. The version of me they tried to erase had become the woman entire boardrooms now applauded. And she wasn't going anywhere. That weekend, I returned to Romano's for the first time since the birthday ambush. The red vinyl booths looked smaller, the specials board still handwritten in familiar cursive. Maria ran to me, arms wide, eyes shining. "I told them," she whispered fiercely into my ear. "I told them they'd remember your name." We sat for hours after closing, just the two of us, surrounded by the scent of garlic and memory. I told her everything, the mentorship, the summit, the plaque, Margaret's letter. She listened like a mother does, nodding, hands always busy, but heart always focused. When I finished, she touched my cheek with flour-dusted fingers. "You gave them the best revenge, Mija. A life so big, they can't reach it." That night, I walked back to my car with a bag of leftover rigatoni and tears drying in the corners of my eyes. I looked up at the night sky, the stars quiet and knowing. I didn't need applause or revenge or closure wrapped in apology. I needed exactly what I had: my name, my worth, and a path I'd built with both hands. And I was never giving it back. Thank you for listening to Jennifer's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.